Right, guys, welcome back to What the Health is Going On podcast. Today, you've noticed Ryan's not here. It's just me riding solo, but I've been joined by an absolute titan in the health and wellness space. This is Martin Fenn. He is the creator of the Neuro Fenn system. Now, that's not the medicine, it's the Neuro Fenn, Fenn. And he owns the Rewiring Pain platform, which is a functional neurology mentorship. I'm biased, I'm in it. I think it's phenomenal, but that's not about my experiences here. I'm going to let Martin take the stage and introduce himself, what he does, and give chance to share with you guys what functional neurology is all about. So, Martin, please introduce yourself to the people.
Yeah, so my platform is all around looking at the missing elements of pain, because as a child I suffered with chronic pain that no one could figure out for ages, and it had a load of other issues as well. So there are chronic gut issues, emotional instabilities, like neurodevelopmental diagnoses, and it was putting all of the pieces of it together and tracing it back to a brain injury and understanding how it all then connected the pain world, the neurology world, the functional medicine world, and looking at the gaps between the systems that people weren't connecting. So it's very much been looking at pain, movement, performance, but from a holistic lens. So looking at how do we see the health side of pain, so what is actually driving threat to tissues that can create pain? How is the brain regulating the central state? Is there anything there that's going on? Can we produce energy required to heal? And is there anything from the more traditional like biomechanics movement world that is coming into it? And then how do we wrap that into how the brain is regulating movement and just systemic physiology? So it's really tying in an all systems approach to rehabilitation and performance.
Yeah, and I can honestly give a testament here. Obviously, I have mentioned I'm in Martin's mentorship personally, and it is such a fascinating space in the terms of it's completely something I feel that's going to be massively included into most functional practitioners or people in the wellness space will be looking into this field, because I think Martin is certainly ahead of his time. He's probably one of the pioneers that are really making it more of a easy to digest and digestible format, I'd say, for coaches like myself with the Rewiring Pain platform. So I guess one thing we could touch on, Martin, is obviously what is the Rewiring Pain methodology, the platform, and who's it really for?
Yeah, so Rewiring Pain is aimed at coaches, clinicians, anyone that works with movement or pain who wants to solve more complex problems quicker and get the results lasting for longer by looking, like I said, at these interconnected systems. Because, for example, like we might have someone with a tennis elbow, but if they haven't addressed it from a neurological principles perspective, they can keep treating that elbow in the traditional lens, but treating that elbow is going to feed information into the opposing brain, which in turn turns down the brain on the same side and turns down the postural regulation centers on the same side. So then it feeds the same muscle imbalance of reducing extensor tone, increasing relative flexor tone that actually feeds the pathology. So we actually have this underlying neurological muscle tone regulation behind a lot of the tendinopathies, myopathies, anything that really has syndrome in the name as well, where we don't really know the cause of it. We can trace back to these postural torsions that stem from a alteration in neuronal firing in areas like the pontomedullary reticular formation that regulate sympathetics, that regulate muscle tone. So then we basically look at how is this feeding in from a neurology principles to try to change movement and change pain, but then understanding that neurological principles perspective, we have to understand that every potential dyshomeostatic driver, so anything that moves us away from equilibrium, can change the perception of threat. So it's then looking at it from the functional medicine lens overlaid into functional neurology to then see maybe this person's getting increased pain, not because there's a tissue issue, but because they've got a cytokine imbalance and it's sensitizing the either peripheral nerves or central nerves to create a perception of increased threat to the tissue that then drives the perception of pain.
And that's just so beautifully put, really. And it makes perfect sense. Obviously, when I was very new to the teachings that you deliver, it feels like it's like being in the Matrix, I say. It's like the red and blue pill selection of seeing, the understanding as to how the brain works. But the way that I've looked at it in my own reductionist way now is the way I visualized it is, it's kind of like if I'm on a PC, right? And I'm doing something consciously on the PC on one program, but behind the scenes, what I don't see is the million data points, all these connections, all these other things running in the background that I'm not consciously aware of, but they're happening. And when you start to, like how you've explained it and broken it down, obviously through a number of the seminars and teachers I've been on, I start to sit there and go, we are missing such a big piece of the picture, and why so many people have experienced this. I've tried everything but had no resolution. And yet this is kind of now that piece of the master puzzle builder that sits there and starts piecing all these pathologies together. And exactly as you said there, it's just a completely new world it opens up to you once you dive into it. It's something completely unique in its own right. And with that, I think one thing that has been the biggest area of interest for me that has come up from it is I'd love you to just break down for people this idea of hemisphericity with brain function. What is hemisphericity, and obviously what are some things that we see with it typically?
Yeah, so like hemisphericity is an imbalance between the function of the left brain and the right brain. Now, each side of the brain has the capacity to do functions or systemic functions. There is a bias towards a potential of either side in terms of an area that it leans more towards, but it doesn't mean just because we've got a right hemisphericity, we can't access some of those right brain biased activities. It just means we're going to have more of a predominance towards the left brain biased activities. For example, there's different like emotional states that are going to be more left or right brain. So left brain being more positive emotion, right brain being more withdrawal. But just because the right brain is more withdrawal, if we have a right brain that's turned down, doesn't mean we won't be able to access those. It's just we're going to have a bias towards more activity of those positive left brain emotions. And it's similar with the immune system. So again, the left brain is more push, more attack. The right brain is more withdraw, pull back, suppress. So we need that balance between both sides. But there's also the physiological state in terms of movement, muscle tone, and so on. So the brain regulates muscle tone. If we have a hemisphericity, we're going to have a reduction of muscle tone on the same side in a asymmetrical manner, where in the upper body above the level of T6, we're going to have a greater loss of extensor tone than loss of flexors, and it's going to flip in the lower body. So we're going to have a greater loss of flexor tone than extensor tone below the level of T6. So we end up in a lot of these like postural torsion type patterns where we might have a scoliosis, like a low dropped shoulder that's internally rotated, and start to see a lot of these presentations posturally that people try and work on with mechanical strategies, and they might get short-term relief. But where there's this central pattern underlying it, it continues actually driving the same biomechanical presentation. Now, that's not to say fixing the posture isn't a part of it, because we need to break the peripheral pattern still, because that's constantly giving input back centrally. But we have to respect where the initiating driver of that dysfunction is coming from, and then start to reintegrate this neural network connectivity that starts to allow the right brain and left to connect more effectively, have wider reaching synapses, so we have better communication throughout, and we can use one side and the other side at will, rather than having this preferential bias towards only one side functioning. And that's largely an underlying principle in a lot of neurodevelopmental disorders, where we'll have this side-based bias, where for like autism, ADHD, OCD, we'll have a left over activity compared to the right. For things like dyslexia, we'd have a right over left. So then we can start to look at what's shaping this lack of connectivity, start to rebuild it centrally through vision, vestibular, cognitive drills, sensory input like smell, light, and so on, but also addressing things from that postural lens. Because as I said earlier, all of that information from the body is feeding back centrally as well. So if we have alterations in that right side, that's going to feed back into that left brain, augment that, and it can continue to turn that right down, and so on and so forth. So we've got to make sure that we are looking at it as this holistic lens, where we're looking at the summation of the inputs rather than just going, I'm going to address the posture and this is going to fix everything. Or I'm going to address the brain and this is going to fix everything. Or I'm going to take these supplements, use these nutritional protocols, and this is going to fix everything. Because I think a lot of people like to look at, in terms of rehab especially, they look at the software, where it's the body, and miss the hardware. The brain that's actually running the show. So if we can look at the hardware, but still respect the software patterns that are running and still address tissue mechanics, because it's all hugely important. And when that's aberrant, it drives threat to the brain. So we're still making sure that people move well, they train well, they've got load tolerance. We're not neglecting that, but it's then thinking, how can I address this centrally as well? Vision, vestibular, primitive reflex integration, all of that. So we get this neural network connectivity that improves movement efficiency while still driving these output-based components of movement. So we're addressing all of the sensory and the brain integrative components of movement, so our output goes better, and so all of our performance goes better. And then layering in the functional medicine side, so we've got anti-inflammatory nutrition and so on that supports our central goals, rather than just thinking, oh, this is a neuroinflammatory condition, I'm just going to treat it through nutrition alone. But what we see with a lot of neuroinflammatory conditions is they result in a neuronal mitochondrial imbalance. And to improve neuronal mitochondrial integrity, we need activation. So we can't out-supplement, out-diet a lack of brain activation. So we need to have the neuroinflammatory nutrition or whatever in place, but then give targeted activation to the brain to improve the capacity of those neurons to make energy, to make ATP, and improve their stability. So it's very much like, if we have an unstable neuron, they're going to be more inflamed. If we have an inflamed neuron, they're going to be more unstable, yet there's very often only looking at one part of the picture, whereas we need to look at, like I said, that totality of information coming in.
Yeah, and I really, that approach that you've explained there was probably one of the biggest eye-opening things for me that I learned from the lessons and teachings that you deliver. And the fact that one of the first core principles I think that you were very vocal on is that you can't outsmart your own brain. It knows what it needs and what it wants and what it doesn't like. And coming back to the senses that you touched on about vestibular and talking about the ocular reflex and these sensory inputs to the body, that explains, if people aren't addressing that, they wonder why the manual approaches from their training or chiro or all these other different physio interventions, massage therapy, why it doesn't stick. And it's because, as you've mentioned, the threat to the central nervous system, which is perceived by a deficit in one of these senses, is one of the biggest missing pieces, I think, overlook. And I would have never realized that without obviously attending one of the seminars for Rewiring Pain. But I guess from your perspective, how would you explain that to other trainers and coaches that are completely new to that as a concept?
Yeah, so we have an element of threat where anything that the brain doesn't recognize or falls outside of its pattern recognition capacity can be construed as a threat, especially if the brain is of lower health, things become more threatening. So anything that can compromise survival can then drive pain or restrictions in movement as a protective output, because the brain wants you to survive. That's its primary objective. Survival is number one. So anything that can potentially compromise survival can drive this nociception, because we do not have pain fibers. We've got nociceptive fibers, which report on actual or perceived threat to tissue integrity. So when we have anything that drives this threat response, we then get this communication to the brain, and it then decides whether it's relevant or not, and if needed, delivers a protective output. Pain might be one. We can have endocrine changes. We can have restrictions in tissue or strength. We can start to have fatigue. And I see it generally being something that's been effective in the past. And by effective, I mean a strategy that stopped you doing things that were causing damage. So for a long time after I dislocated a hip, or majorly subluxed a hip bordering on dislocation, whenever I was about to get sick, I'd get some left hip pain, even though mechanically it had been rehabbed. But it was almost like this early warning sign where it's like, oh yeah, this really got you to slow down and stop for a good 6 to 9 months. So now we're going to use this as an early warning system whenever we've got a threat to the system as a whole, which was often like, it could be viruses, it could be whatever. Let's make that tissue hurt because it worked in the past. For other people, it might be headaches or fatigue, and then there's that component. But then we also have to think mechanically. There can be a component of sensory mismatch as well. Because if my eyes are perceiving the world around me, that's an input of where things are in space. Now, what happens if I've got a ocular motor imbalance where the eyes are so much finer motor control than even the hands? So think about now, every eye movement might be a fraction of a degree off, but now I've got alterations in how I perceive the world. What happens if I've also got a vestibular imbalance where my brain now thinks a slightly tilted head is my perception of up? So now I've got a different perception of which way is up and where things are in space. Now when I go to reach something, I might be grabbing a glass, all of the input from the sensory fibers, the mechanoreceptors in my hand, in my arm, when I grab that glass, are feeding back that that's not where we thought it was based off the visual information. So now there can be a lot of subtle postural distortions to try and make those two sensations match. And even more so if we've got a vestibular imbalance lying over the top of that as well. So we might then have these three competing sensory systems that are all telling us where I am in space and where things are in space. They're all giving slightly different information, and our body's constantly trying to make the cleanest picture of those that it can, and it often results in these like minor, subtle joint position errors, or whatever lens you want to look at it with, whether you're a chiro, osteo, physio, PT, or whatever, will have these very subtle shifts in expressions of movement, but they compound over time.
Yeah, that, like I say, the explanation of that is just spot on. It sounds, I know it's going to be a lot of information to people that probably start watching this and thinking, what else did any of that mean? But again, we'll stress to you, if this is something that does interest you, definitely you want to be checking out Martin's mentorship in his Rewiring Pain platform. One thing that I'd like to actually add on to that, when you mentioned about pain receptors, I remember in one of the lessons was a study you shared where there was, I believe, it was someone having open heart surgery, and they just stimulated the periaqueductal grey with electrical stimulus, right? I think that's right. And
So the periaqueductal grey, it has some descending modulatory capacity. Now there have been some like older studies, and I can't remember explicitly if it was human or animal, but there was no stress responses, increase in pain responses, performing open surgery while delivering neuronal stimulus to this region called the periaqueductal gray that has powerful descending pain modulation capacity. So it's very much like showing how this response of pain can be centrally derived, but also centrally inhibited, which comes into a lot of this hemisphericity, neuroinflammation, brain imbalances. Because when we have a neurological issue, a lot of the time it's inhibitory systems that we lose first. But people miss the loss of inhibitory systems because as an industry, we are so focused on output and doing more. But when we see things start to fire when they're not supposed to be firing, so we get increased pain, we get hyperalgesia, allodynia, things like this, it's often a case of we need to look at the areas that are losing the inhibition that can't calm down the areas that are firing excessively. And one of the big things that causes the loss of these inhibitory areas is sensory deprivation. And some big things for sensory deprivation are sedentary lifestyles and things like immobilization. So anything that reduces sensory awareness can drive these central changes that affect inhibitory systems, some of the big ones being like the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum. So we're really seeing these alterations in systems that coordinate movement, pain, sympathetics. And so we can start to see a lot of these things that people struggle with being like movement disorders or increases in pain, inability to regulate a stress response from the loss of these inhibitory systems.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to see when you get into the depths of it, of what actually we can see on a deeper level, and we know what to look for. I mean, it's kind of that, another analogy I like to refer to people that have asked me questions on it, and I'm not as well versed as you are, but like if you had a car, you wouldn't be aware of any issue with the car if there was no warning lights on the dashboard. And that's why those things are flagging up and showing that there's an issue for you to look deeper into something. And this is exactly the same kind of presentation, a different way, but like with discussions I've had with you, it's now a weird thing is watching people walk and seeing dysfunction in walking patterns. I never thought it would be as interesting to watch people walk, like just in the gym or in general spaces when people watch in general. But you start to notice all these weird patterns that people are doing, like walking on their toes, loss of arm swing, internal rotation of upper limbs or external rotation of lower limbs. And it's just absolutely fascinating. I know it's not anything that you should be looking for in people, but from a coach perspective, like it gets super interesting when you look at it through that lens, as you mentioned, of those patterns that you can see from hemisphericity patterns or dysfunction, which is showing on, like you say, on the hardware. The software is actually feeding out to project that manipulation or presentation.
Well, using that car analogy again, the expression of movement is the check engine light.
Yeah.
So we might not necessarily see what's going on in their brain unless we're getting like functional MRIs, EEGs, things of that nature, which are going to be, unavailable to a lot of people. So we have to then think, how can we use these functional measures? So this is functional neurology rather than like looking at it from the more clinical side, but using functional expressions to then determine the integrity of pathways. So what we're just talking about movement there, when we understand the brain, we understand movement. When we understand movement, well, to understand movement, you have to understand the brain, because movement is an expression of brain function. There isn't a motor output that doesn't have a neurological driver. So the more we can understand the brain, the more we can understand movement. But then the more we can understand movement, the more we can potentially understand other central consequences. So like Tom was saying there, if we have a loss of arm swing, we know that the initiation of the motor commands to swing the arm come from the opposite side hemisphere, feeding down to something called the red nucleus that then initiate that flexion. So if I see someone with a loss of arm swing, I might then want to cross-correlate this against functions of cognition on the other side of their brain. Or it might be functions of eye movement or vestibular function or other things that I can use as these functional biomarkers of contralateral brain function to build out a picture of maybe this is the highest hierarchical need for this individual at this moment in time. And just tracking that back to, can I do this within 5 to 10 steps of watching someone walk? Because I know the expressions of movement. I'm going to have this loss of arm swing feeding into a hemisphericity, so that turning down of brain function. I might see like central instabilities where they've got wobbly heads, unstable spine, vaulting, where they might slowly drift and quickly correct back to center, where there's again instabilities in visual vestibular function, all things coordinating like midline outputs like the respiratory systems and so on. Or we can see these other PMRF and cerebellar type patterns dependent on the positions of the limbs in gait, where now I've got a framework very quickly where I can start to do tertiary testing to confirm my hypothesis of maybe there's something centrally mediating their imbalance in gait. So now it goes from these lengthy assessments to, I can watch someone walk into the treatment room, walk into the gym, and immediately know like, okay, they've got a loss of arm swing here, they're vaulting to the right. Maybe I need to look at their vestibular integration, and maybe I need to look at their right hemisphere to coordinate that left arm swing more effectively and start to then really integrate these systems quickly. And then I've got an immediate test retest to go see, did my hypothesis prove true? Did it make the change I expected, or do I need to tweak something?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's definitely opened up my eyes to the sheer amount more assessment you can actually get from like you say, whether it's clients in person or even online if we film these assessments, that you can see and just get so much more useful information. And I guess one thing it leads me into is, what's your response to everyone that says, oh, all disease or all issues start in the gut? Because I know that's one of the biggest terms we've got on social media in the health and wellness space, unfortunately. What's your interpretation in response to that is what you see people say online?
So the gut is hugely important, and we have obviously a lot of interplay between the gut and other systems. So obviously we've got the gut-brain axis, we've got mesenteric lymphatic transport from the gut to the lungs and vice versa. So we've got this huge interplay between the gut and systemic physiology, especially if we've got like leaky gut and we've got more like endotoxemias. So there is a huge interplay between the gut and systemic physiology. But the way I work in terms of a hierarchical order of needs is looking at things that completely prevent recovery. And the gut isn't one of those. And then we've got tier 2 factors, which are systems which slow or alter the ability of tier 1 systems to function, which a leaky gut would fall under. And then we've got tier 3 factors which slow the rate of healing, but you can still get better. And this is where a lot of our like maldigestion and other gut issues fall under. Now, the exception to some of that would be like active celiac flares, active autoimmune flares, where that would fall under like an active tissue damage, which drives all of the cell danger responses, mitochondrial damage associated molecular patterns, which derail systemic physiology more. But that's more of an active autoimmune cascade rather than thinking this is a gut pathology or a gut issue that is the main driver. It's more of the misregulation of immune response. So then when I'm thinking tier 1, this is looking at more things like an anemia where we're derailing the capacity for cellular energy production, mitochondrial issues, things of this nature where there is an inability of a tissue or system to heal rather than it just slowing down.
Yeah, fantastic. I think it's so useful to get that wider lens of looking at the body is a system and it's nothing in isolation, and that is such a key, I think, teaching point which I've for sure picked up obviously inside the Rewiring Pain platform, and trying to just echo that out to a wider audience with other coaches that may watch this or people watching, to understand that there's so much more depth you can go into to grasp addressing someone on the whole as a system, then looking at things in isolation and treating them in isolation essentially. And as Martin said there perfectly, it's like segmentation again is dependent on presentation and what they currently have, but again looking at the whole system is really important. I guess one thing that I'd like to head in towards wrapping up this call is, what would you say is some of the biggest red flags or issues that people or other coaches looking at people for assessment with regards to neural inflammation presentations? What are some of the biggest things that people would look for or tend to see?
Yes, it depends on the severity and intensity of the neuroinflammatory presentation. But as we're getting to more chronic neuroinflammation, it would be more like brain fog that persists. So it's not these transient, maybe hour to hour, day to day events, but it's chronic, constant, over weeks, over months, brain fog, and maybe sickness behavior type syndromes where we start to lose motivation, start to lose drive, need to sleep more, because there's direct research showing that an increased need for sleep lowers health outcomes. It actually increases risk of mortality. And part of this is an increased need for sleep is often a neuroinflammatory presentation where there's an inability to drain the lymphatic system, so we're unable to drain the brain of waste. So there's this increased need for sleep to try and get into the sleep stages to actually drain the brain of waste. So we're looking at things like this. Is there a sudden increased need for sleep? Maybe we've got increased sensitivity to chemicals or things that result in an alteration in brain function. But this is a really key differentiation to make in terms of brain function as well, where is it neuroinflammatory or is it more neuronal mitochondria? And we can start to see the difference here between deficits of brain function or inflammatory type activity and what's driving the alteration in the brain. So for example, this might be, let's just say for argument's sake, I've got a frontal cortex issue. So I'm thinking attention, cognition, executive function. Now, did that get worse when I was exposed to an inflammatory driver? So maybe chemicals, petrols, fragrances, gluten, if they're sensitive, things of this nature, like dietary protein reactivity. So was there an immunological driver, or did their brain start to fall apart when they were using it? So did they start to get neurological symptoms from activation? Then we need to think it's more of this neuronal energy production type of presentation, or if it's from more inflammatory drivers, then we're thinking more neuroinflammatory, and we address it accordingly. So then we're just thinking, where is the system of issue? So is it frontal and I'm getting these more cognitive attentional issues? Is it cerebellar, so I'm losing capacity, regularity, rate, rhythm, force, and accuracy of movement? Is it more like pontomedullary reticular formation, so I'm starting to get postural changes? And then saying, okay, is this inflammatory or is it activation induced? And then either regulating inflammatory tone or regulating activation to that region, and finding a threshold of activation that improves the presentation and doesn't fatigue it. Now, the fun part is most of the time it's both, because as I said earlier, neuroinflammation will alter neuronal mitochondrial function and vice versa. When we've got that downturn in neuronal energy production, we have an increase in inflammation. So we usually have to address both at some point. There's just going to be one of those systems that we need to leverage a little bit more to get the shift in the other one.
That hierarchical order is, yeah, I think it's just an absolute game changer. And I think if people up to now still haven't understood or bought into Martin's ideas or actually want to know more, this is where you actually want to be finding Martin on social media and on his platform. So Martin, where can people reach out to you and find you if they want to know more, find out more, or learn about the Rewiring Pain system?
Yeah, so the easiest place is going to be on Instagram, where there's a lot more information readily available about the systems that I use. Clippets from seminars where you can start to see how it all pieces together, and that is the pain teacher _Martin. And then there is a lot of information about the structure of the courses, mentorships on there as well. There is actually an upcoming live seminar workshop in Western Australia in the next couple of months. Whether I'm back to Europe anytime soon or where the next one's booked are a work in progress, but the online one is always available, and like I said, goes into all of the depths of the functional medicine models, which are based off the 4 pillars of pain being nociception, neuroinflammation, energy production, and systemic inflammation, and how those 4 pillars integrate into affecting the physical world, which we then have the practical frameworks overridden in terms of rewiring pain, where we've then got a framework of action that incorporates systemic physiology from a practical sense in all of those patterns Tom mentioned earlier about gait presentation.
Phenomenal. Guys, I just want to take a moment to really thank Martin for his time. I will include his socials in the description, and I'll even put an image on screen for where he mentioned on Instagram to follow him. Martin, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate your time joining me on this call, and the insight and information is truly game changing. I will say that to everybody because I am in Martin's mentorship, and if you're a coach, whether you are a practitioner in osteopathy or a chiropractor, you want to look into the functional neurology space more, I can testament to say how useful the platform is and the differences supported me in my own health and with clients I work with. So, Martin, thank you very much for your time. This episode has been an absolute blast, and really looking forward to getting all this content and piece stuff together moving forward. So thank you for your time, and really appreciate you joining me today.
That's
awesome.
A pleasure,
Guys,
as always,
and
mate.
if you've got any questions that come up or you're interested, please do drop them down in the comments below. Again, follow and reach out to Martin if it's something of interest to you, and I will catch you all on the next episode.